Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Giovanni Rolla. He is professor of philosophy at Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. And today we're going to talk about enactivism, ecological psychology, and embodied cognition, and the combination of them. So, Giovanni, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. It's lovely to be here. I'm very glad that you invited me. It's an amazing opportunity to talk about my work, and I am so glad to be here.
Sure, it's my pleasure. So let me ask you first about enactivism. So, what is enactivism? And by the way, what got you interested in enactivism as an approach in cognitive science?
Okay, so, well, to put it simply, enactivism is a relatively recent approach to the cognitive sciences and philosophy of the mind, let's say in the last 30 years, a little bit more. And it emphasizes the continuity between life and mind, autonomous action, and consequently bodily morphology in its account of cognitive phenomena. So this is the general picture. Of course, there are different branches of enactivism. We can talk about that later. But in general, enactivists claim that in order to understand how the mind works, we got to understand how the organism acts in its environment and how it maintains the dynamics with its environmental setting. So, and how those dynamics matter for said organism, matter at a very fundamental biological level. So, whereas a more traditional account would explain the cognitive states as processes that have, let's say, a semantic content and carry information for the organism, information about the distal sources of stimuli, and activism takes a different approach. And I got into it because I was interested in understanding, let's say, how we could naturalize perceptual states, how to naturalize perceptual states. And I saw that as a viable opportunity to let's say, to deal with this issue from a philosophical standpoint, but also a philosophical standpoint that has a very, let's say, a solid scientific background.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, since you mentioned that enactivism is a fairly recent approach in cognitive science, how would you compare it to the more traditional approaches there? And I mean, how much scientific support would you say it has?
Okay, so basically, I think that the main difference is about the foundational question for the cognitive sciences, which is what is the mind? Mm-hmm. Whereas a more traditional approach would take it as essentially a matter of representing the external world, and it is the outcome of the cognitive revolution in the 50s, and as a way to move beyond behaviorism, which would neglect the kind of internal states that the mind supposedly has. And that is the general picture for the traditional approach, that the mind is a computation machine that represents the external world. And this has been the ongoing mainstream cognitive sciences in the last 70 years, 80 years. Mm-hmm. And enactivism, well, it's fairly recent. We used to say that the Embodied Mind, the book by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Elena Roche is the locus classicus of the enactive approach. But also you have earlier work by Francisco Varela, and even before that you have Gibson working on ecological psychology, which is against the mainstream of the cognitive sciences. And from the philosophical standpoint, enactivism suggests a change of picture, that's not what the mind is supposed to do. And then when you look at the evidence of how organisms behave and how we could not implement and build artificial agents based on the ancient picture, the cognitivist picture, with the same success as we do in navigating our environments, this counts as a kind of empirical evidence. But the turning point is to think of the mind as not as our cognitive systems in general, not as representing the external world, but as enabling the organism to act in its environment. And for this, you need to have a body that is that sustains a certain dynamic with its environment. So, in terms of empirical support, I would say that most empirical support comes from the experiments that were conducted by the ecological psychologists. They are not enactivists, of course. They are in a neighboring, they are a neighboring approach in a way. But I think that the large amount of evidence that they have gathered in the last 40 years or so could be used to support also an activist approach to the cognitive science, because I think enactivism is a philosophical. It's an attempt to change the point of view of the cognitive science from the philosophical point of view. So that I would say is the main difference.
Yes, and we're going to get also into ecological psychology later in our conversation. But so, do you think then that enactivism has the potential to provide us with a stronger or more robust explanatory framework of the mind than cognitivism and computational/representational approaches to the mind?
I think at least it has the potential to offer a different picture.
Okay.
And maybe we will need to assume a pluralist stance and try to analyze different aspects of cognition from different standpoints. But at the very least, I think enactivism raises important questions about, well, what were we neglecting in the old school cognitivist way of thinking about mind? But maybe this is not something that will be settled empirically, I guess. It's something about the foundational concepts of, well, defining what the mind is and defining what cognition is. And of course, we can search for partial evidence that support either one of those views. But I think thinking of the mind as a computation, a machine that computes information about the external world misses a lot of important things. And that's what enactivism tries to bring forth in this debate.
Oh, okay, and what are some of the things that the more traditional approaches miss? Could you give us some examples just for people to have a better understanding of what you are talking about here?
Of course, yeah. So when we think about the mind that way, as a machine that computes information about the external world, we are assuming a metaphor that the mind is a computation machine. It's like a computer. So essentially a computer with a different hardware, let's say, a biological hardware. And that would require us to think that limitations in implementation of this kind of framework in artificial agents. So limitations of implementation in this case would mean that, well, we just need more processing capacities. And that's not it, as we have seen time and time again. Artificial agents, they do not become more like human when you add more computation capacities to them. Because there are a lot of stuff that we do in our everyday scenarios, like picking up stuff, walking around the busy street or stuff like that. That is not exactly a matter of computing external information, but also it's a matter of attuning to environmental dynamics. And as I said in the beginning, in order to do that, you need to have an embodied agent that has physical capacities and has to explore those possibilities for action. And what I think is, if that was, computing external information is all that we are doing in such cases, then more processing capacities would be needed to deal with the kind of case that we actually, the kind of stuff we actually do in our everyday scenarios. But I think that's not it. That's the misguided point of view. So that's one point. The other thing is that when we talk about representing an external reality, representing an external world, we often assume, scientists often assume that that's the role of the brain. However, if you look at how neuronal states, they are activated with let's say, the execution of a simple task, let's say perception and picking up some object or opening a door or stuff like that. Well, neuronal states, they do not have this semantic capacity of representing something else. They lit up with electrochemical signals, but they are not standing for something else. This is a conceptual issue. So scientists often use this vocabulary that is inherited from not only cognitivism, but way before that, from modern scientists, of brain states representing the world. But I don't think that is also, I don't think that's actually correct. I don't think that brain states represent the external world. I think that they might covary with certain actions and possibilities for action, but to say that they represent is adding something more. So in most textbooks, you can switch representational parlance, as in brain states represent external realities, or brain states representing language or stuff like that, with just activation of neuronal patterns without any loss of meaning. So I think that's another problem, another conceptual problem that people usually import is metaphysical claim about how the brain works, about the possibility of having semantic states in our neuronal patterns of brain activation, stuff like that, without actually considering the implication that, well, physical matter does not represent the external world.
Do you also consider the other three E's in 4E cognition? I mean, embodied cognition, extended cognition, and embedded cognition. Of course, we're going to talk more about embodied cognition in a bit, but do you also consider the other two E's or not?
Well, I think usually when we think of 4E in cognitive sciences, we are thinking about embodied cognition, enactive cognition, embedded, and extended, right? So some people also add ecological cognition, and I don't know if that was what you were thinking about. And I've seen talk about emotional cognition in some places that would make it 6E, and also I don't know if we ever get to 7E, but anyways, I don't like that label very much, because I think that enactivism already implies some variety of embodied cognition, namely radical embodiment, which is basically this eliminative stance on mental representations that I was talking about. And on the other hand, some embodied theories defend a more conservative view on embodiment, which is embodied, which comprise embodied representations. Think, for instance, in Barcelou's work in linguistics. There you have embodied representations, but this goes against enactivism. So there are finer distinctions that we should make, I think. And the same thing goes for extended cognition. If you take, for instance, Clark and Chalmers' original work on extended cognition, it is functionalist at its core, because it doesn't matter what the hardware is made of, let's say, it matters how it functions. And so that's why you can have like an external notebook as a memory instead of only your brain. But this is incompatible with the embodied approach, because the embodied approach rejects functionalism, and it claims that, well, the body is fundamental, essential for cognitive states. It's a constitutive of cognitive states, and the same thing goes for enactivism. So I try not to use the term 4E anymore, and I think they are more or less, the thing is, they came about more or less simultaneously. And that's why I think people used to think that of a single program, but I think there are many differences. And I think it's more important to draw out those lines more clearly.
Okay. And in your work in cognitive science, how do you combine then enactivism, ecological psychology, and embodied cognition? I mean, what is the relative role that each of those frameworks brings into the picture?
Okay, so because I'm a philosopher of cognitive sciences, and I don't do science myself, unfortunately, much to my chagrin. I'd love to, but one thing that I've done in several occasions is sort of to look over the shoulder of what scientists are doing and how they think certain experiments confirm or refute certain philosophical claims, which might not be clearly stated to themselves sometimes. That's not the main goal of the scientist to refute a philosophical claim, but sometimes that's the implication. And then I annoyingly say, well, that's not actually right. You haven't proved that. You haven't refuted that. There is another explanation, and so on. And in doing so, I try to open some theoretical space to consider alternative explanations for what seems to be settled phenomena that seemingly can only be explained in one way or another. So the same thing goes for embodied cognition. I think embodied cognition goes in the same direction as a general term for approaches that reconsider the role of the body in explaining cognitive states. And as for ecological psychology, as I said, I think it's much more empirical than enactivism. And they share some fundamental agreements. Of course, ecological psychologists and enactivists, they have the same concerns about what is a viable explanation of how the mind works in different cases. And it has loads of empirical evidence to back it up, which is always great. And I think ecological psychology, it's an ally for enactivism. Sometimes I have written in terms of an ecological enactive approach or an active ecological approach, whatever. But I think they build a certain picture that can be put to work together, a very pragmatist picture of how the mind works that reconsiders the role of the body and the action of the organism in explanation.
And so earlier you mentioned, when I asked you about to what extent do you think enactivism would be supported by science, you mentioned that ecological psychology would be the framework to provide an empirical support for enactivism. So what are ecological enactive approaches to cognition then?
Well, okay, so the ecological enactive approach tries to combine activism, of course, which is the claim that cognition emerged from the dynamics between organism and environment. And from the ecological view, you have the idea that cognitive states detect, or they involve the detection of information for action, and that's how you can test the claim. Together, they imply that cognition is not in the head, but in the dynamics between the agents and environment. And to explain these dynamics, you can use the idea of possibilities for action or affordances and solicitations. And that's how you can test those views, by looking at how agents behave differently in settings where the affordances change. And one very famous case, the experiment where subjects are they are given backpacks with certain different weights on it, and the subjects perceive a slope. It's the same slope for all subjects, but they perceive it differently according to the weight of their backpacks. So that's a very famous kind. That you have several experiments that test, for instance, the perception of gaps in the floor, if you can jump them, if they are walkable, and this relates to how, if I'm not mistaken, of how elastic is your musculature in your legs or stuff like that, not your height, as one would suppose. And that's how you can see that the role of the body in cognition as changing how objects perceive possibilities for action. And that's the importance of the ecological and active approach that highlights these aspects. So we perceive things in certain ways because they allow us to act in certain ways, which in turn are constrained by our bodily morphologies, our current interests and abilities. And this is not to say, of course, that the neurodynamics are not important, but they are not the whole story when we try to understand the mind, and we cannot neglect the extra neural body.
So let me ask you about a topic that I know you've explored in your work. What is information in cognitive science? What does it mean for a cognitive system to acquire information about its surroundings?
Well, the notion of information is a disputable notion because it depends on how you understand the function of a cognitive system. I mean, it changes everything. So A classical view would say that the function of cognition or of a cognitive system is to represent the external world, and in that view, information could be understood as the semantic content carried by mental representations about the distal source of stimuli. So when I perceive something, I have a distal source of stimuli, the thing that causes certain representation, certain stimuli in my, let's say, visual perception, my brain processes this as information about that thing. So on that view, a cognitive system acquires information about something, let's say, given state of affairs, if it has mental representations that were acquired through very specific means, as in this example, visual stimulation. Information would be the semantic content of mental representations in that field that takes the mind as a computer that represents the external world. And that would be the classical view, which I think enactivism has a strong case to reject for very specific reasons. I don't want to enter those reasons, but basically, it's, as I said in the beginning, it's very hard to naturalize this notion of mental representation. It's very implausible that we will ever be able to do that. And it requires rethinking about rethinking the role of information for enactivism. Or we can, I don't think we should, but some people say that we should forgo this notion altogether. I don't think that's correct. I think we can talk about a plausible view of information that is not committed to semantic content of the external world.
Okay, and what would such a view be? I mean, is there an enactive ecological approach? Because that's the kind of approach you bring into your work to information.
So what I take from radical enactivism, which is one branch of enactivism, the recent branch by Dan Hutto and Eric Min, is that information is a matter of covariation between states of affairs. So my perceptual state of readiness to action, let's say of grasping an object, covaries with the affordances for that object. Mm-hmm. When I perceive a cup of water, I have this readiness to action that covaries with my perceptual state. And this, of course, involves a specific pattern of neuronal activation. But the idea is that nowhere in this picture we are forced to assume that the stimuli cause inner representations of external states. And all we have here so far is a matter of covariation. And this is scientifically viable. So assuming that the environment is favorable to my perception, that there is no, if everything goes all right, let's say, and that my skill set is sufficiently well developed, that's the part that I developed with my very good friend, Eros Carvalho. I minimize uncertainty by enacting a certain sensory motor scheme. Let's say extending my arm and grasping that object. So I see a cup of water and I had this readiness to action, and I want to grasp, this is in my interest, to grasp it and to drink the water. I extend my arm and grasp the cup of water. I am minimizing uncertainty because the enaction of that sensory motor scheme covaries with the end goal, grasping the object. Mm-hmm. And that's how I know that if I do this, of course, I don't need to represent that consciously. I don't need to think about that. I just do it. But I know that, or I have the know-how of extending my arm and grasping the cup of water and bringing it to my mouth is sufficient to my goal. And of course, there are many different actions I could take in that scenario that would not lead to the success of drinking the water. I could drop it, I could miss, I could do a lot of stuff. And the importance of embodied know-how is to minimize uncertainty in this case.
Tell us more about know-how. I mean, what is know-how, and particularly what is embodied know-how?
Okay, so know-how is, of course, a type of knowledge. It's it has been distinguished from knowing that, propositional knowledge. So for those who are not familiar in this literature, propositional knowledge has been the the main kind of knowledge studied in the philosophical debate in the last 100 years or so. And that is knowing that something is so and so. Know-how, on the other hand, is practical knowledge. In principle, at least, it seems to be so. It's a kind of knowledge that implies having an ability to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And propositional knowledge, on the other hand, is a knowledge that something is so and so, as I said, and they seem to be different kinds of knowledge. However, some have tried to reduce one kind of knowledge to the other. Some have argued that know-how is no different from knowing that, and some other philosophers have argued that those are in fact distinct kinds of knowledge. But the idea is that, in my take, that know-how is not about representing the world with accuracy and justification as propositional knowledge. And one example for that is knowing how to practice a sport. If you acquire and refine a relevant set of skills, you do not need to hold any particular belief about the stuff you are doing. You just exercise those skills in playing that sport, let's say football or whatever, tennis,
Mm-hmm.
whatever you think. Of course, you can enter that reflective stage if you are sufficiently proficient in that activity. You can think about stuff while you are doing, and this actually helps athletes in some cases, but it is not necessary for you to have that. It's not necessary to have success in engaging in that activity to have this reflective state. All you need is the relevant know-how in most cases. So know-how is practical knowledge, and I think there is no fundamental difference between, maybe a matter of emphasis, between know-how and embodied know-how, because I think all know-how is ultimately embodied, but it might seem not to be the case in some particular cases when we think about, for instance, our ability to master symbols using a language. It seems to be disembodied at first glance. It seems that it doesn't matter the body you have in order to understand a given language. But I think that misses the bigger part of the picture because, well, you have to emit sounds and you have to grasp objects and manipulate objects to write symbols. So it's not entirely true that it's not true that mastering a language is a matter of disembodied know-how. So, however, first appearance, I think that all know-how is embodied. If you take the view that, well, you need to have a body to exercise the abilities that are relevant for know-how.
Mm-hmm.
Well, please go.
No, I mean, do you wanted to add something or?
Well, I mean, I think that's a bit more. It's a bit more bold, but I think that propositional knowledge also involves know-how. So propositional knowledge, knowing that something is the case, involves knowing how to articulate symbols. So I also think that very indirectly, propositional knowledge is also embodied in a way. But that's very speculative. I don't have enough well-articulated reason to defend that view, but I think that ultimately even propositional knowledge is embodied, but in an indirect manner.
Yeah. Tell us about this enactivist conception of bringing forth a world. What does that mean?
Well, okay, so this phrase, bringing forth a world, it occurs, as far as I can tell, the first time in the Embodied Mind, that book by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche. And it is used to explain how the enactive conception evades both a certain realist inclined and then an idealist inclined views in the cognitive science, both realist and idealist takes. There are certain undertones in the cognitive sciences of the day that could go either way. So the kind of realism that the authors of the Embodied Mind were concerned about is the view that cognitive systems, they simply capture the outside world through inner models or mental representations. So you have the outside world, and the role of the cognitive system is to capture it. So let's say to represent it, to receive information and rebuild it internally as to mirror the outside world. And the idealist inclined view, on the other hand, assumes that cognitive systems project the inner structure onto the world. So as they do that, they not only receive information from the outside, they also project it onto how they structure these stimuli. Both are very prevalent in the cognitive sciences to this day. And you can see discourse shifting either way, depending on the case. So the point is that in virtue of the fact that living beings, they explore the relevant features of the environment, as enactivists claim, they bring forth a world of significance. And this is often understood metaphorically. In most literature about enactivism, this phrase is understood as a metaphor for perceiving what matters for the organism. Mm-hmm. And indeed, at the time of the embodied mind, there were not many references in evolutionary biology to back up a more literal construal of that claim. But now we have evolutionary synthesis, extended evolutionary synthesis, the view that other factors beyond trait selection should be accounted to explain evolution. And one of those factors is niche construction. Mm-hmm. The idea is that organisms affect their surroundings by their doings, and in doing so, they shape their reality by building their niches. And this changed reality, this cumulatively changed reality of the world, it is brought forth by previous generations, and it's a non-generic inheritance that affects future generations. So mm-hmm. it's this is the kind of evolutionary dynamics that we, Nara Figueiredo, a good friend of mine, and I argue that it provides some basis for a literal construal of bringing forth a world. Organisms actually shape the reality, and this is in fact a matter of not a naive realism, but let's say a constructivist realism that could be understood as the metaphysical import of the enactive approach to the cognitive sciences, that we actually bring forth a world, not only metaphorically, but literally.
Mm-hmm. On the topic of evolution, I mean, evolution by natural selection, and you also mentioned there the extended evolutionary synthesis and a phenomenon like niche construction. What is evolution as natural drift? And tell us about this idea of how structural couplings between organism and environment trigger viable pathways of maintenance and reproduction instead of simply selecting the most adapted trait to a pre-given environment.
Okay, so the claim natural drift, I think, is that the phrase natural drift, the label, is the idea that Maturana and Empedoses developed. I think they did so first in Spanish, if I'm not mistaken, and which later Evan Thompson called enactive evolution. And it's a very programmatic idea that evolution is not the passive selection of the fittest, but the view that evolution makes room for general constraints within which organisms develop their structural couplings, or as I've been using the term dynamics more loosely, but their dynamics with the environment that allow them to strive. And I think natural drift is an interesting idea. It is underdeveloped, I think, in the literature. It's very programmatic, as I said, but to my mind, I think the latest work on it is Evan Thompson's 2007 book that it dedicates a few chapters or sections on it. But the idea is interesting to account for evolution in a similar way that autopoietic theory accounts for life in general. So that's what Maturana and Empedoses were trying to do. But we tried to fit that in our argument, Nara and I, to some success. I think that we recognize that, well, there is also something here that leads to the enactive idea that organisms are not simply passively under environmental constraints, they are also acting upon the environment. So this is how we try to fit in with the discussion of niche construction, which is very clearly the idea that the organisms, they act upon the environment, and in so doing, they affect their evolutionary pathways. And it is Of course, the authors that defend niche construction are not originally concerned with the enactive approach or the debate in the cognitive sciences, as you look at work by Laland and others. But even though they do not use the term enactive approach to evolution, it's very clearly consistent with this take. They come from a different background from the evolutionary biology, but it seems that they are working in a similar direction as Maturana and Empedozes, and later on Varela and Thompson, when they were talking about enactive evolution.
And what is then more broadly the link between enactivism and evolutionary dynamics?
Well, the core enactivist idea is to bring the living organism, to the center of the cognitive sciences, which means to think of living systems not as passive recipients of external forces and external stimuli, but as creatures that act upon their environments. So if we extend that view of life, as some people use the term adaptive autonomy, from the cognitive sciences to evolutionary biology, the idea is that to think of living systems as partially responsible for their evolutionary pathways. Of course, not as if living systems know the end goal of their evolution. Of course, they do not know that, but the way they act upon their environments affects their evolutionary pathways, meaning that they are not simply subject to evolutionary pressures as the modern evolutionary synthesis would claim, that we only select traits that enable survival. So, as I said, I think niche construction is one way to meet that condition. And I find a lot of similarities between niche construction theory and the general lines of the enactive theory of evolution. And that's one way to cash out this idea that we are partially responsible in a sense that what we do matters for our evolutionary pathways, in the same way that what we do matters for our self-maintenance as individual systems or living organisms.
So another different kind of topic: do pre-linguistic infants have representational abilities? And if so, what do you think would be the implications of that for an enactivist approach to cognition?
Okay, so regarding the first part of this question, well, if they did, that would be a problem for those theories that claim that the language precedes representational abilities, which means that our capacity to represent internally a given state of affairs is an outcome of mastering a language. That's my view, and it's also something that other enactivists have claimed. In contrast, some cognitivists, or most cognitivists, would say that we have an innate ability to represent the world. This is actually what defines cognitivism. So some psychologists have tried to show that pre-linguistic children have innate mechanisms to represent the world. And they supposedly have shown that by registering the reaction time of children when observing normal versus unusual scenarios, they can prove that children have these innate mechanisms for physics and intuitive physics and stuff like that. So they create very unusual scenarios, and normal variant of those scenarios, and they register how long it takes children to observe, pre-linguistic children, 3 or 4 months old, for how long they observe the unusual scenarios in comparison to the usual normal scenarios. And what they noticed is that in normal situations, the reaction time does not change across the board, but in very unusual scenarios, which are designed by the scientists to be physically impossible, let's say, by a matter of trickery, they use very elaborate settings. The children keep looking at the scenario for a longer time, for much longer. So the interpretation, the empirical data is that they are surprised because, according to the cognitivist reading of this empirical data, the physically impossible stuff violates their expectations. So it means that they can only have, that it's only possible to explain that by appealing to certain innate mechanisms that are manifested long before mastering a language.
Mm-hmm.
So in a recent paper, I argued that enactivism and embodied cognition more generally have the tools to explain that this difference in reaction time, and it undercuts the representationalist interpretation of the empirical data. One of these ways is to argue that in those experiments, children must be habituated with the normal scenario, the usual circumstance where nothing magical happens, before you measure the difference in reaction time. And this habituation that happens over several expositions to that normal scenario creates a certain pattern, a habitual pattern of sensory-motor schemes, if you will. And when you introduce something radically different, they break this pattern. This borrows from the work by Esther Talen and others. But this is one way to say that, well, this is not what's happening right now. It's not a matter of representing the innate mechanism for representation being alert. It's actually the fact that we are breaking the habit that was introduced in the experimentation, in a previous phase of the experimentation. And this is one way to claim that. The other way is to say that, well, and I was following the work that Nat and I did together a few years before that, well, we bring forth a very physically stable world, and we select in virtue of that cognitive mechanisms to engage with a physically stable world. So when something seemingly physically impossible happens, our cognitive states and our cognitive capacities are not endowed with the means to deal with that. Mm-hmm. So it's plausible that we, even before mastering a language, there's something awkward in that draws our attention. But that's mainly because over our evolutionary history, the world we have been dealing with is very physically stable. So if one object simply disappears at one end of the screen and reappears at the other, then something must be amiss. And this is the kind of experiment the psychologists were doing in the 80s. They were doing several different experiments where children would look at this elaborate scenario where things would disappear and reappear, or be cut in half, and you wouldn't notice that they are different parts of the same object or stuff like that. And well, these are the two main explanations that go against the mainstream literature in the cognitive sciences that would say that, well, of course they have innate mechanisms to represent the world because they are surprised, and my attempt is to say, well, it doesn't follow. You can have alternative explanations that do not appeal to representational abilities, even in pre-linguistic children. So it might still be the case that our representational abilities, they show up after we have developed a language and mastered the public symbols that characterize a language.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you mentioned several times during our conversation radical enactivism. So tell us more about that. What is radically enactive cognition?
Well, the phrase radical enactive cognition comes from Hutto and Eric Means' work, their book on radicalizing enactivism that was released in 2013, and draw a lot of attention because therein they argue that even some enactivists are not being as radical as they claim, because they are making concessions to cognitivism in their work. So Hutto and Min, they argue that they defend an eliminative stance on representational content, because they argue that it is impossible to naturalize. Basically, the idea is that, well, I think I said that at the beginning, but representational content implies that patterns of neuronal activation have semantic content, and you cannot find that in nature. You cannot find semantic content in nature. In a way, semantic content is in the eye of the beholder. We ascribe it to neuronal states. We see a pattern of neuronal activation and see the execution of a certain task or perception of an object, whatever, and we say that this represents that, but that's our ascription because we are endowed with a language to do so. And radical enactivism is the claim that even some other enactivists are actually doing something similar when attack, for instance, of sense making, which is a core concept in traditional enactivist literature. And this, as I said, drew a lot of attention because it is in a way a kind of friendly fire in the enactivist trenches against cognitivism, because, well, it tries to sanitize enactivism from implicit cognitivist bias. And I do not think that that's the case for sense making exactly. I think we can defend the idea of sense making as the notion that organisms perceive and engage in their environment according to how those engagements matter to them. And I think that we can preserve sense making as something that is in principle compatible with radical enactivism. But some other works from enactivist adjacent literature, such as Alva No's work on sensory motor enactivism, that I think is more complicated because he claims that perception is a matter of understanding how the world would unfold through my actions. And this understanding how, even though it's not at surface level a matter of propositional knowledge, seems to be understanding that the world will behave so and so if I act so and so. So radical enactivism tries to clean the enactivist literature from that language, and in so doing, of course, it takes a very strong stance against some other enactivist approaches. But basically, the idea is that we have no, we do not have good grounds to defend the existence of mental representations, and we should rectify our scientific language from this usage.
And how about high cognition? Do you think it can be explained by enactivism and embodied cognition?
Well, I think so, because high or higher cognition is, it depends on how you cut where you draw the line between basic or lower and higher cognition. But basically, the idea is that certain aspects of human cognitive performance are radically different from how other animals behave in their environments. And the idea of explaining higher cognition through an activist means is to take a bottom-up approach that begins with the relation between basic biological processes and basic cognition, basic intentionality, a basic kind of directness to the world, and work upwards towards more complex cases of cognition, such as language use and inferential abilities and reasoning and counterfactual reasoning, stuff like that, stuff that does not involve the immediate environment. So, of course, we are capable of doing those things. I can think of what I will do this weekend, or what I have done in the past, or if something happens, I will do something else. So all of these cases, they are at surface, at least, very different from picking up stuff from my desk or writing in the computer, where the physical environment is the object of my engagement. But in most of those cases I mentioned, there is no physical environment to engage with. So the attempt to explain those other cases of cognitive processes that are seemingly different from that, there are more than one, there are different approaches to do that, but the one that I favor is that once, and this is not something that I created, again, I defer to the work of Dan Hutto and Eric Min, but once we manage to master symbolic use by engaging in sociocultural exchanges something that we do when we are very little, we enter this capacity to manipulate symbols, and symbols allow us to replace absent targets in our cognitive performances. So again, coming back to the question about how language is it precedes representational abilities. The idea is that once we manage to master symbolic structures, we can use them as surrogates for absent targets. And this is something that explains cognition from the bottom up, because we need to explain how certain engagements allow for the mastering of a language, and so how those exchanges happen at a very young age. And this, of course, must happen before we have any sort of language. So the idea is to explain higher cognition, not by assuming innate representational mechanisms, which is, of course, which should be much easier if we were doing that, but from the bottom up. And I think there are tools to do that. I think we can explain how we are capable to direct ourselves to absent stuff by engaging by using symbols as surrogates once we have mastered the uses of those symbols.
Okay, so I have one last question, and still on the topic of higher cognition, and to explore one example of it here. How do you approach rationality from a radically enactive cognition perspective?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Thank you, Ricardo. Because I came up with the idea of radically enactive rationality as a label for something that I have found is sparsely in the literature before. Susan Hurley, 20 years before me, she had asked whether the pragmatic turn in the cognitive sciences, the enactive turn, had any implications for what we call rationality. And I believe it has implications for rationality, and as she did as well, in her own terms. So the idea is that philosophers are used to think of rationality as a symbolic, language-based procedure that happens at the surface level of consciousness and functions to motivate or justify decisions and beliefs. I think this is only partially correct, because it appeals to a level of rationality that we become endowed with to the extent that we master, as I said before, symbolic structures. But if that were the case, if rationality is this, let's say, the tip of the iceberg phenomenon, then much of what we do cannot be considered rational, according to the to the enactive approach, because much of what we do is not symbolic, is not contentful. It's a matter of direct engagement with the environment. So it creates a certain problem of matching those two ideas, the classical idea of rationality and what enactivism claims that we actually do when we engage with our environment. So I suggested we should reconceive rationality as a kind of meta ability that enhances adaptive behavior, one that is not necessarily symbolic, but might be in some cases that involve reasoning. Reasoning allows us to enhance our social cultural adaptive behavior in order to defend ourselves and motivate our point of views. But this is, again, the tip of the iceberg. And this meta ability to coordinate multi-level structures allows organisms in general to optimize their engagements with their environment. That was the idea in very broad strokes. So to some extent, rationality is a tool that allows us to adapt to unforeseen circumstances. And that's something we excel at, but we are not the only living beings capable of doing so. And the consequence for this is that if this is correct, rationality is not something exclusively human, which I think is a positive consequence, because it allows to situate rationality in this naturalization continuum where, well, other organisms adapt in sort of ways that we would consider them partially or almost as rational as us. And it works if you consider, for instance, other large primates and other sufficiently complex organisms. And also, on the other hand, if you have an organism that is critically unable to overcome environmental circumstances that are outside of its immediate set of abilities, it is fated to die in there. So you wouldn't say that it's highly rational. It is very limited. I think about, for instance, if you surround a snail with salt, it cannot go either way. It is stuck there and it is going to die eventually. But more complex organisms develop ways to counteract environmental circumstances. And I think this is a very minimal account of rationality that is not, well, it's not mainstream, of course, but I think it accounts for different problems, conceptual problems, and allows for a naturalization of rationality as well. So that's how I understand it.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, Dr. Rolla, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Well, you can find my website, which is, well, I'll give you the address and you can put on the link description. But,
yes, sure.
That's where I put all my latest work and some thoughts, some non-philosophical thoughts as well. And that's where basically all my stuff is.
Okay, great. I will include that in the description of the interview. And thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a very interesting conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, Ricardo. Thank you so much for having me.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.